The fluorescent lights in Rick Donovan's garage flickered twice before settling into their usual anxious hum. Outside, snow was beginning to fall across Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the kind of late November snow that promised a brutal winter ahead. Rick stood over the disassembled Chevy engine, his hands blackened with oil that had worked itself into the lines of his palms so deeply that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove it. 42 years of turning wrenches had left their mark. "It's done," he said, not looking up at the man standing across the workbench. "Cracked block, probably been leaking coolant into the combustion chamber for months. You kept driving it, didn't you, even when it started overheating?" Tom Henderson shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his work boots squeaking against the oil-stained concrete. "I thought it was just the thermostat." "Yeah, well, it wasn't." Rick straightened up, feeling his lower back protest. He was 63 years old, and lately his body had started keeping count of every engine he'd ever rebuilt, every transmission he'd dropped, every hour spent bent over an engine bay. "You need a new engine, or a new truck. This one's finished." Tom's face went pale. Rick had known him since Tom was a kid, riding his bicycle past the garage on summer afternoons. Now he had 3 kids of his own and a construction business that depended on that truck running 6 days a week. How much would a rebuild cost? Rick wiped his hands on a rag that was already saturated with grease. "More than the truck's worth. I'm talking 5, maybe 6,000 if we go used. New engine? You're looking at 10 grand easy, plus labor." "Jesus, Rick." "I know." And he did know. Rick had been delivering bad news to customers for 4 decades. Some took it better than others. Tom was one of the good ones. Paid on time, didn't argue about prices, understood that mechanics didn't make problems, they just found them. "I wish I had better news for you, but I won't lie to you. This engine's scrap metal." Tom stared at the disassembled parts spread across the workbench like mechanical organs laid out for autopsy. "Can I get a second opinion?" The question hung in the air between them. Rick felt something tighten in his chest, a familiar mixture of pride and defensiveness. In all his years, he'd built a reputation. Honest Rick, they called him. The guy who wouldn't sell you parts you didn't need, who'd tell you to take your car to the dealer if the problem was still under warranty, who'd fix things right the first time. "You can take it wherever you want," Rick said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I'm telling you what I see. That block is cracked. It's not a matter of opinion." Tom nodded slowly. "It's not that I don't trust you, Rick. It's just, that's a lot of money. I need to be sure." "I understand." And he did, even if it stung. "Where you thinking of taking it?" "My daughter mentioned a place. New shop that opened up over on Commerce Street next to the old lumber yard. Carson's Auto Repair." Rick had heard about Carson's. Everyone in Millbrook's small automotive community had. They'd opened 6 months ago with brand new equipment, flashy signage, and prices that undercut everyone else by 20%. Rick had driven past it once, seen the gleaming bay doors and digital diagnostic machines visible through the windows, and felt something like dread settle in his stomach. "Never heard of them doing engine work," Rick said. "Thought they mostly did oil changes and brake jobs." "Melissa says they do everything. She took her Honda there last month for a timing belt. Said they did good work." Melissa, Tom's daughter. Rick remembered her as a serious kid who'd helped her dad on job sites during summer breaks, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. She'd be in her 20s now. Probably didn't remember the time Rick had let her sit in his '67 Mustang and pretend to drive it while her dad waited for a repair. "Well, like I said, you're free to get another opinion, but I stand by my diagnosis." After Tom left, towing the truck behind his wife's SUV, Rick stood alone in the garage. The space suddenly felt cavernous and cold. The heating system struggled to keep up with the Pennsylvania winter, and Rick pulled his coveralls tighter around his shoulders. He looked around at the garage that had been his life's work. The walls were lined with tools he'd accumulated over decades, some inherited from his father, some bought with his first paychecks when Reagan was president. The calendar on the wall was from 2019, a promotional gift from a parts supplier that had gone out of business during the pandemic. Rick walked over to a workbench near the back wall, where a faded Polaroid was tucked into the edge of a pegboard. The photo showed him and Linda, maybe 15 years ago, standing in front of a restored '69 Camaro they'd worked on together. She'd helped him with that one, keeping him company during late nights in the garage, bringing him coffee and sandwiches, listening to him explain the intricacies of a carburetor rebuild, even though she'd never particularly cared about cars. "I just like watching you happy," she'd told him once. Linda had understood what this garage meant to him in ways their children never quite did. She'd seen it as more than a business. It was his identity, his connection to his father, his way of making sense of a world that kept changing faster than he could keep up with. When she got sick, when the cancer came back for the third time and the doctor said there was nothing more they could do, she'd made him promise to keep the garage running. "Don't let it die with me," she'd said, her hand weak in his. "You need something to live for, Rick. This place keeps you going." He'd kept that promise for 4 years now, but lately Rick wondered if he was honoring her memory or just being stubborn. The garage was dying slowly, losing customers to bigger shops with better equipment, to chain stores with cheaper prices, to places like Carson's with their modern diagnostic tools and younger mechanics who'd grown up with computers. Rick touched the Polaroid, his finger tracing Linda's smile. She'd been gone 4 years, 3 months and 16 days. He still counted. The silence in the garage pressed against him. When his father had run this place, it had been full of noise. Mechanics arguing about the best way to rebuild a transmission, customers chatting while they waited. The radio always tuned to the local AM station playing country music. Now it was just Rick and the ghosts of better days. His phone rang. It was his daughter, Sarah. "Hey, honey." "Dad, I've been trying to reach you all morning. Did you forget to charge your phone again?" Rick glanced at his cell phone sitting on the workbench. The battery icon showed 3%. "I've been working. I wanted to remind you about Thanksgiving. You're still coming, right? The kids have been asking about Grandpa all week. Thanksgiving. It was Thursday, 3 days away." Rick had forgotten about it entirely. "Yeah, of course I'll be there. Are you bringing anyone?" "Sarah." "I'm just asking, Dad. It's been 4 years since Mom died. You can't work alone in that garage forever." "I'm not alone. I've got customers." "How many customers, Dad?" "Really?" The question landed like a punch. Rick looked around the empty garage. On the lift sat a Subaru Outback that belonged to the Methodist church secretary, needed a new catalytic converter. In the corner was a vintage motorcycle someone had dropped off 2 months ago for restoration work that Rick kept putting off. That was it. 2 vehicles. The appointment book on his desk was mostly empty. "You've got enough," he said. Sarah sighed. "Okay, Dad. I'll see you Thursday. Come around too. And please, try to wear something without oil stains." After they hung up, Rick walked over to the small office area tucked in the corner of the garage. The desk was buried under invoices, parts catalogues, and shop manuals that he'd been meaning to organize for months. On the wall hung a photograph from 1985. Rick and his father standing in front of this same garage, back when it had been called Donovan and Son. His father had started the business in 1962. Rick had taken it over in 1990, dropped the "and Son" from the sign, and figured he'd run it until retirement. But retirement was supposed to mean handing the business to someone else. And Rick didn't have a someone else. His son, Michael, had gone to college and become a software engineer in Seattle. Sarah was a dental hygienist with 2 kids and no interest in cars beyond making sure hers started every morning. There was no one to hand the garage to, no legacy to pass down, just Rick, getting older, watching the world change around him while he stayed in the same place. He thought about Carson's auto repair, with their new equipment and young mechanics. He thought about Tom Henderson taking his truck there for a second opinion, as if Rick's 42 years of experience could somehow be wrong about something as straightforward as a cracked engine block. The fluorescent lights flickered again. Rick made a mental note to replace them, then forgot about it immediately. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on the windowsills and muting the sounds of traffic on Main Street. Rick turned off the lights in the main bay, locked the front door, and headed to his truck in the small parking lot behind the garage. As he drove home through the darkening afternoon, he passed Carson's auto repair. The lights were blazing inside, and through the windows, he could see mechanics moving with purpose, customers waiting in a clean, modern lobby. Rick kept driving. His house was 15 minutes outside of town, a small ranch on 3 acres that he and Linda had bought in 1987. She'd wanted space for a garden. He'd wanted a big garage for project cars. They'd both gotten what they wanted, and for 35 years it had been good. Now the garden was overgrown. The big garage held nothing but boxes of Linda's things he hadn't been able to sort through, and the house echoed when he walked through it. Rick heated up leftover pasta, ate it, standing at the kitchen counter, and went to bed at 8:30. The phone call came on Wednesday afternoon, the day before Thanksgiving. Rick was under a Honda Civic, replacing a leaking oil pan gasket, when his cell phone started buzzing in his pocket. He ignored it. People who called during work hours usually wanted to complain about a bill or ask if he could squeeze them in for an emergency repair that wasn't really an emergency. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Cursing under his breath, Rick slid out from under the car and grabbed the phone. Unknown number. Donovan's garage. Mr. Donovan, this is Katie Carson, from Carson's Auto Repair. Rick's hand tightened on the phone. Katie Carson. He'd heard the name but never met her. Word around town was she was young, maybe 30, had moved to Millbrook from somewhere out west, and had enough money to open a full-service garage with all the latest equipment. What can I do for you? I wanted to talk to you about Tom Henderson's truck. He brought it here yesterday for a second opinion on the engine. Rick felt his jaw clench. And? You diagnosed a cracked block. Said the engine was finished. That's right. There was a pause. Rick could hear noise in the background, the sound of air tools and machinery. A busy shop. Mr. Donovan, I examined the engine this morning. I ran a pressure test, did a visual inspection with a bore scope, and analyzed the coolant. There's no crack in the block. Rick stood up so fast he felt dizzy. What are you talking about? The block is fine. The issue is a failed head gasket. It's allowing coolant into the combustion chamber, which is why the symptoms looked like a cracked block. But it's repairable. I can have the truck running again by Friday for about $1,200 in parts and labor. That's impossible. I inspected that engine myself. I saw... Did you do a pressure test? I didn't need to. I've been working on engines since before you were born, Ms. Carson, I know a cracked block when I see one. Another pause. When Katie spoke again, her voice was measured, professional. I'm sure you do, Mr. Donovan, and I respect your experience. But in this case, the diagnostics show a different problem. I wanted to call you as a professional courtesy, one mechanic to another. Professional courtesy. Rick's voice was rising now. You're calling to tell me I was wrong. I'm calling to tell you what I found. Tom asked me to reach out to you before I started the work. He values your opinion, and he doesn't want this to become... awkward. Awkward. Rick laughed, a sharp sound with no humor in it. You mean he doesn't want me to be embarrassed when everyone finds out you proved me wrong? That's not what I... You know what? Go ahead and fix it. Do your work. But when that engine fails in 6 months because you put a Band-Aid on a structural problem, don't come crying to me. He hung up before she could respond. For a long moment, Rick stood in the middle of his garage, phone still in his hand, breathing hard. His mind was racing. A head gasket. She thought it was just a head gasket. He'd been working on engines since 1980. He knew the difference between a blown head gasket and a cracked block. The symptoms were different. The leak patterns were different, unless they weren't. Rick walked over to his workbench and pulled out his diagnostic manual, a thick, spiral-bound book that was more comfortable to him than any computer screen. He flipped to the section on cooling system failures. Head gasket failure, coolant in oil, white exhaust smoke, overheating, loss of coolant. Cracked block, coolant in oil, white exhaust smoke, overheating, loss of coolant. The symptoms were nearly identical. Rick closed the book and shoved it away. No, he'd inspected that engine. He'd looked at every inch of it. A mechanic with 42 years of experience didn't make mistakes on something this fundamental, but doubt had crept in, and once it was there, it was hard to dislodge. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Rick finished the Honda, sent the owner on their way, and closed up the garage early. He drove home through the November twilight, the sky the color of old bruises, and found himself taking the long way past Carson's auto repair. Tom's truck was in one of the bays, hood up. Someone bent over the engine. Rick slowed down as he passed, trying to see who was working on it, but the angle was wrong. He drove on, feeling pathetic and angry with himself for caring. At home, he poured himself a whiskey, something he rarely did on weeknights. The house was too quiet. He turned on the TV, flipped through channels without seeing anything, turned it off again. His mind kept circling back to the phone call, to Katie Carson's calm, professional voice telling him he'd been wrong. The worst part was that she hadn't been smug about it. She hadn't gloated or lectured him. She'd been respectful, courteous even. That somehow made it worse. Rick's phone buzzed with a text message. Sarah. Just confirming tomorrow, 2 p.m. Love you, Dad. He texted back a thumbs-up emoji, something Sarah had taught him how to do last year. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving. He'd eat turkey with his daughter's family, play with his grandchildren, and pretend everything was fine. Then he'd come home to his empty house and his failing garage, and the growing certainty that the world had moved on without him. Rick finished his whiskey and poured another. The next morning, Thanksgiving Day, Rick woke up with a headache and a sense of dread. He showered, put on his cleanest pair of jeans and a flannel shirt Sarah had given him for Christmas, and drove to her house in Harrisburg, an hour east of Millbrook. Sarah lived in a development of identical houses with small yards and attached garages. Kids' toys littered the driveway. Rick parked on the street and sat in his truck for a moment, gathering himself. The front door opened before he reached it. His grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, came running out, 7 and 5 years old. You full of energy and questions. Grandpa, we're making pumpkin pie. Did you bring your toolbox? Dad says the dishwasher is making a weird noise. Can you tell us about the race cars again? Rick scooped them both up, one under each arm, and carried them into the house while they shrieked with laughter. For a moment, the weight he'd been carrying lifted. Sarah's house smelled like turkey and sage dressing. Her husband, Dave, was in the kitchen basting the bird. He shook Rick's hand, offered him a beer. The house was warm and full of life, and Rick felt like an intruder from a colder, quieter world. Dinner was good. The turkey was perfect. The conversation pleasant. Sarah's in-laws were there. Nice people who asked polite questions about the garage. Rick gave polite answers, said business was steady, didn't mention the empty appointment book or the phone call from Katie Carson. But Sarah knew him too well. Halfway through the meal, while everyone else was debating whether to watch football or play board games with the kids, she caught his eye across the table. There was a question in her look, a concern that Rick recognized from when she was a teenager and could tell when he was worried about money or stressed about the business. After dinner, while the kids played in the basement and the adults drank coffee in the living room, Dave asked Rick about the dishwasher. It's making this grinding sound when it drains. I'm worried it's the motor. Rick went to the kitchen and listened to the dishwasher run through its cycle. The grinding was rhythmic, metallic. Not the motor. Something stuck in the drain pump. He pulled out the lower rack, removed the filter assembly, and found a small plastic toy lodged in the impeller. He extracted it, reassembled everything, and ran the cycle again, silent and smooth. "Just a dinosaur," Rick said, holding up the tiny plastic T-Rex. "Tyler's, probably." Dave laughed. "You're a miracle worker, Rick. I was about to call a repair guy." "Save your money. It's a 10-second fix." But as Rick washed his hands in the kitchen sink, he thought about all the customers over the years who'd brought him simple problems that they thought were catastrophic failures. A loose battery cable they'd been convinced meant a dead alternator. A clogged air filter they'd thought meant engine damage. Most of the time, the simple answer was the right answer, unless you were too experienced to see it. Unless you jump to the complicated diagnosis, because that's what your 42 years of pattern recognition told you to look for. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, 2 coffee cups in her hands. She handed one to Rick. "Come outside with me for a minute." They stepped onto the back deck, where the November cold bit through their sweaters. Sarah wrapped both hands around her coffee mug for warmth. "You want to tell me what's really going on, Dad?" "I'm fine, honey." "You're not fine. You barely said 10 words during dinner. You've got that look you get when you're worrying about something." Rick took a sip of coffee, buying time. Sarah waited with the same patient silence her mother had always used, a silence that made it impossible to keep secrets. "I made a mistake," Rick finally said. "A big one. Misdiagnosed an engine problem on Tom Henderson's truck. Told him the engine was finished, needed to be scrapped. He took it to that new shop for a second opinion, and it turns out I was wrong. They fixed it for a fraction of what I quoted him." Sarah's expression softened. "Everyone makes mistakes, Dad. Not like this. Not at my level. I've been working on engines since before you were born. I should have known better. I should have run more tests, been more thorough. But I was so confident, so sure I knew what I was seeing." He paused. "The young woman who runs the other shop, Katie Carson, she called me, very professional, very respectful, made it clear she wasn't trying to embarrass me. But Sarah, she's 30 years old and she caught something I missed. What does that say about me? It says you're human. It says I'm old, out of touch. The world's moved on, and I haven't moved with it." Sarah set down her coffee and turned to face him directly. "Okay, so what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do? I don't have the money to buy all new equipment. I don't have the energy to learn completely new systems. And even if I did both those things, I'm still a 63-year-old man competing with people half my age. So retire, sell the garage, move closer to us. The kids would love having you nearby. You could help Dave with house projects, come to Emma's soccer games, actually have a life outside of that garage." Rick looked out at Sarah's backyard, where Tyler's swing set stood motionless in the cold. It was a good life she was describing, safe, comfortable, filled with family, a normal retirement. But the thought of selling the garage, of walking away from what his father had built, from what he and Linda had maintained together for 35 years, it felt like dying. "I made your mother a promise," Rick said quietly, "before she died. She made me promise to keep the garage running. Mum also made me promise to make sure you didn't work yourself to death. She wanted you to have a life. Dad, not just a business. The garage is my life." "No, it's not, or it shouldn't be. You're more than Donovan's garage. You're my father. You're Emma and Tyler's grandfather. You're a person who deserves to be happy, not just productive." Rick felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Then maybe it's time to learn." They stood in silence for a moment, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside, through the window, Rick could see Dave and the grandparents watching football. the kids running upstairs with construction paper and markers for some project. "That Katie Carson," Sarah said, "the one who found your mistake. What's she like?" "Young, smart, has all the latest equipment, professional. She actually called to offer some kind of partnership, suggested we refer customers to each other based on who's better suited for the work." "And what did you say?" "I was too angry to say anything productive. Hung up on her, actually." Sarah laughed, not unkindly. "Very mature, Dad." "I know. I need to call her back, apologize. Maybe actually consider what she's proposing. Maybe that's the answer. You don't have to do this alone, and you don't have to compete with her. There's probably room for both of you if you work together." Rick thought about that. Partnership had never been his style. He'd always been independent, self-reliant, the guy who figured things out on his own. But independence was lonely. And self-reliance only worked when you were still capable of handling everything yourself. "When did you get so wise?" Rick asked. "I had a pretty good teacher," Sarah said, squeezing his arm, "even if he is stubborn as hell." Rick dried his hands and went back to the living room, but the doubt stayed with him. On the drive home, he made a decision. Tomorrow, Friday, he would go to Carson's auto repair. He would look at Tom Henderson's truck. He would see for himself what Katie Carson had found. And if she was right, if it really was just a head gasket, then Rick would have to face a truth he'd been avoiding for a long time. Maybe experience wasn't enough anymore. Friday morning arrived cold and grey, with frost crystallizing on every surface. Rick sat in his truck in the parking lot of Carson's auto repair, engine running, heater blasting, trying to decide if he had the courage to walk through those doors. The shop was already open. Through the large glass windows, he could see mechanics moving between vehicles, the glow of computer diagnostic screens, a customer talking to someone at the front counter. Everything looked efficient, modern, purposeful. Rick's garage, by comparison, felt like a museum piece. He cut the engine and got out before he could change his mind. The lobby was bright and clean, with comfortable chairs, a coffee machine, and a flat-screen TV playing the morning news. A young man at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Good morning, do you have an appointment?" "I'm here to see Katie Carson." "Is she expecting you?" "No, but tell her Rick Donovan is here." The young man's expression shifted slightly. Recognition, maybe curiosity. "Just a moment, sir." Rick waited, hands in his pockets, feeling out of place. The lobby had that new car smell, all fresh paint and clean carpet. His boots left faint tracks on the floor. Katie Carson appeared from the service bay, wiping her hands on a shop towel. She was younger than Rick had pictured, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and grease under her fingernails. She wore coveralls and work boots, and when she extended her hand, her grip was firm. "Mr. Donovan, I'm glad you came. I want to see the truck." "Of course, follow me." She led him into the service bay. The space was immaculate, with epoxy-coated floors, LED lighting and tool chests that looked like they'd been bought yesterday. 4 bays, all occupied. Rick counted 3 mechanics working, all younger than him by decades. Tom Henderson's truck was in the far bay, hood up. Katie walked over to it and gestured to the engine. "I've already done the head gasket replacement. I wanted to call you before I put everything back together, but you hung up, and I didn't want to bother you on Thanksgiving. Come take a look." Rick approached the engine bay, his trained eye immediately cataloging what he saw. The engine was partially reassembled, the new head gasket visible, everything clean and properly torqued. He'd done thousands of head gasket jobs in his career. This one was textbook perfect. "Where's the old gasket?" he asked. Katie walked to a parts cleaner and pulled out a tray containing the removed parts. The old head gasket was in pieces, showing clear evidence of failure between cylinders 3 and 4. The kind of failure that would allow coolant into the combustion chamber, the kind that would create symptoms identical to a cracked block. "And the block?" Rick asked, his voice tight. Katie picked up a tablet and pulled up a series of photos. "These are from the borescope inspection. I checked every inch of the coolant passages and cylinder walls. No cracks. The block is completely sound." Rick looked at the photos, zooming in on each one. She was right. The block was fine. He'd been wrong. The realization hit him like a physical blow. 42 years of experience, and he'd misdiagnosed a head gasket as a cracked block. He'd told Tom Henderson to scrap a perfectly salvageable engine. He'd been so confident, so certain, so old. "Mr. Donovan?" Katie's voice was gentle. "Are you okay?" Rick set down the tablet. His hands were shaking slightly. "How much is Tom paying you for this?" $1,200, like I said. That includes the new gasket set, machining the head, coolant flush, and labor. $1,200 versus the $6,000 Rick had quoted for a used engine replacement. Tom had nearly made a decision that would have cost him thousands of dollars based on Rick's wrong diagnosis. "I was going to do a pressure test," Rick heard himself say. "I meant to, but I was so sure when I saw the symptoms, I knew what it was, or I thought I did." "It's an easy mistake to make," Katie said. "The symptoms really do look identical unless you run the tests." "You ran the tests." "I always do, even when I think I know what's wrong." Rick nodded slowly. That was the difference between them. Katie relied on data, on modern diagnostic equipment, on systematic processes. Rick relied on experience, intuition, pattern recognition, and this time his intuition had failed him. "How long have you been a mechanic?" Rick asked. 10 years. I started in my dad's shop in Oregon when I was 20, went to trade school, got my ASE certifications, worked at a dealership for a while, saved up and opened my own place here about 6 months ago." "Why Millbrook?" Katie smiled. "I drove through on a road trip and liked it. Small town, seemed like it could use a modern shop with good equipment, plus the real estate was affordable." "You came here to compete with me." "I came here to run a business, but yeah, I guess in a way we are competitors." She paused. "For what it's worth, people in town speak highly of you. They say you're honest, that you do good work. Tom Henderson was torn up about getting a second opinion. He respects you." "Respected me," Rick corrected. Past tense. "Wait until word gets around that I almost cost him $4,000 on a misdiagnosis." "It doesn't have to be like that." "What do you mean?" Katie leaned against the workbench, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Donovan, can I be honest with you? I'd prefer it. The automotive industry has changed a lot in the last decade. Cars are more complicated now. They're essentially computers on wheels. The diagnostic equipment, the tools, the training, it's all different from what it used to be. I'm not saying the old ways don't matter. Experience is valuable, but it's not enough anymore, not by itself." Rick felt defensive anger rising but forced it down. She wasn't wrong. "When I opened this shop," Katie continued, "I did my research on the area. I knew about Donovan's garage. I knew you'd been here for 40 years. And I thought maybe there was a way we could work together instead of against each other." "Zidi, you work together how?" "You've got knowledge I don't have. Experience with older vehicles, custom builds, things you can't learn from a manual. I've got equipment and training in modern diagnostics that you don't have access to. What if we referred customers to each other? I send you the vintage restorations and specialty work. You send me the newer vehicles that need computer diagnostics. We both benefit." Rick stared at her. The idea felt both sensible and like a defeat, admitting he needed help, that his way of working wasn't sufficient anymore. It went against everything he'd built his identity on. But as he stood there in Katie's immaculate shop, looking at Tom's truck with its salvageable engine, Rick's mind went back to a conversation he'd had with his father in 1989, just weeks before the heart attack that killed him. They'd been working on a customer's car, something Rick couldn't even remember now, and his father had made a mistake. torqued a bolt too tight and stripped the threads. It was a small thing, easily fixed, but Rick had watched his father's face crumple with frustration. "Getting old, Rick," his father had said, staring at his hands like they'd betrayed him. "Used to be, I could feel exactly how tight was tight enough. Now my hands shake, my feel is off. Body's giving out on me. Dad, it's one bolt, not a big deal." "It's not about the bolt, it's about what comes next. When do I become more liability than asset? When do I hold you back instead of helping you forward?" Rick had laughed it off at the time, told his father he was being dramatic. 3 weeks later, his father collapsed in the garage office and died before the ambulance arrived. He was 61 years old. Now Rick was 63, standing in a competitor's shop, confronting the same question his father had asked: when do you become the problem instead of the solution? "I need to think about it," Rick said, his voice rougher than intended. "Of course, take your time." Katie pulled out a business card and handed it to him. "My cell number's on there. Call me if you want to talk more." Rick took the card and slipped it into his pocket. He looked at Tom's truck one more time, at the engine that wasn't ruined, at the problem that had been fixable all along. "When Tom comes to pick this up," Rick said, "tell him I'm sorry, tell him the mistake was mine, and if he wants to bring his vehicles back to me in the future, I understand if he doesn't." "You could tell him yourself," Katie suggested. "No," Rick said quietly. "I don't think I can face him right now." He left Carson's auto repair and sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine. The frost had melted from the windshield, but Rick felt colder than he had all morning. As he sat there, he noticed a detail he'd missed before. Next to Carson's gleaming shop was the old lumber yard. Empty now, windows broken, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. Rick remembered when that place had been thriving, back in the 80s and 90s. The owner, Bill Morrison, had been convinced his business model was timeless. "People will always need lumber," Bill used to say. But then Home Depot opened 20 miles away. Bill refused to adapt, refused to change his pricing or his inventory system or his customer service approach. "I've been doing this for 30 years, he'd insisted. "I know what works." The lumberyard closed in 2003. Bill died alone 5 years later, bitter and broke. Rick started his truck and pulled out of the parking lot, the parallel suddenly too clear to ignore. You could be right for decades and still end up wrong if you refused to acknowledge when the world had changed. The drive back to his garage took 10 minutes, but it felt longer. Rick kept replaying the conversation, seeing the photos of the undamaged engine block, feeling the weight of his mistake. But more than that, he kept seeing Katie's face, respectful, professional, someone who saw him as a colleague worth consulting rather than an old man to be dismissed. She could have just fixed the truck and let word spread about Rick's mistake. Instead, she'd reached out, offered partnership, treated him with dignity even when he'd been defensive and rude. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, he'd made several decisions. First, he would close the garage for the day and go through his diagnostic equipment. What still worked? What needed updating? What was he missing that had caused him to make such a fundamental error? Second, he would call Tom Henderson tonight and apologize directly, not through Katie Carson. Third, he would seriously consider Katie's proposal about referring customers. Pride was expensive, and Rick couldn't afford it anymore. Inside the garage, he walked to his office and sat at the desk that had been his father's. The photograph of the two of them hung on the wall, young and confident, proud of what they'd built together. "I'm sorry, Dad," Rick said to the empty room. "I think I'm losing this." His phone rang. It was Tom Henderson. Rick almost didn't answer, but running away wasn't going to change anything. He picked up. "Tom, I'm so glad you called. I need to apologize." "Rick, hold on. I wanted to call you before you heard it from someone else." Katie fixed the truck. It was the head gasket, just like she said. She did great work, had it done in a day, charged me exactly what she quoted. I know. I went to see her this morning. Tom, I'm sorry. I was wrong about the block. I should have run more tests before giving you a diagnosis. I nearly cost you thousands of dollars on my mistake. There was a pause. Rick, I'm not calling to blame you. I know you thought you were right. Everyone makes mistakes. Not like this. Not at my level of experience. Listen to me, Tom said, his voice firm. You've been fixing my vehicles for 20 years. You've saved me money more times than I can count. You've been honest with me even when it meant losing work. One wrong diagnosis doesn't erase all that. Rick felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. That's generous of you. It's the truth. But Rick, I need to tell you something else. Going forward, I think I'm going to take my vehicles to Katie's shop. And there it was, the inevitable consequence. I understand, Rick said. It's not personal, it's just they've got the equipment for the newer trucks. And the hours work better for my schedule. But if I ever get another project car, something vintage, you'll be the first person I call? Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. After they hung up, Rick sat in the quiet office. He'd lost a customer. He'd made a serious professional mistake. He'd been offered a partnership he wasn't sure he deserved. The photograph on the wall seemed to judge him. His father had run this garage with nothing but hand tools and mechanical intuition. He'd built a reputation without computers or diagnostic scanners. He'd made it work for 30 years. But his father had also died in 1989, before fuel injection became standard, before OBD2 ports, before cars started having more computing power than the Apollo missions. His father had never had to adapt to a world that had fundamentally changed. Rick pulled out Katie Carson's business card and stared at it for a long time. The weekend after Thanksgiving was quiet. Rick spent Saturday morning at the garage, taking inventory of his diagnostic equipment. What he found was sobering. Tools that hadn't been updated in 10 years, software that wouldn't connect to anything made after 2015, and a pressure testing kit that he couldn't remember the last time he'd used. He made a list of what he needed. The total came to nearly $8,000, money the garage didn't have in its account. Rick could dip into personal savings, but then what? The equipment would sit in his garage gathering dust because he didn't know how to use it properly, didn't have the training or the customer base to justify the investment. The realization was stark. He couldn't fix this problem alone. Not with money, not with determination, not with 42 years of experience. The world had changed, and either he changed with it or he became obsolete. Rick locked up the garage and drove into town, past the shops that had closed over the years, the hardware store that couldn't compete with Home Depot, the bookstore that lost to Amazon, the video rental place that never saw streaming coming. Millbrook's Main Street was half empty now, a monument to businesses that had refused to adapt. He didn't want Donovan's garage to become another empty building with soap scum windows and a for lease sign. On Sunday, he drove to the cemetery where Linda was buried. The headstone was simple grey granite, her name and dates, the words, "Beloved wife and mother," underneath. Rick brought fresh flowers and stood in the cold November wind, trying to figure out what to say. "I think I'm done, Lynn," he finally said. "The garage, I don't know if I can keep it going anymore." The wind rustled through the bare trees. Rick imagined what Linda would say if she were here. She'd been practical, direct, never one to sugarcoat things. She'd probably tell him to stop being stubborn and do what needed to be done. There's this young woman, Katie Carson. She opened a shop in town, real modern place. She wants to work with me. I don't know if I should do it. Feels like admitting defeat. The flowers trembled in the wind. Rick pulled his coat tighter. Sarah thinks I should sell the garage and retire, move closer to her and the kids. But what would I do all day? Play golf? I don't even like golf. He paused. I miss you. I miss having someone to talk this through with. You always knew what to say. You'd probably tell me I'm being an idiot, that pride is expensive and I can't afford it anymore. A crow landed on a nearby headstone, cocked its head at Rick, then flew away. The thing is, Lynn, I made you a promise. Said I'd keep the garage running, but I don't think I can do it the way I've been doing it. Something has to change. And I'm scared that changing means I failed you, failed Dad, failed everything we built together. Rick stood there until his feet went numb and his fingers ached from the cold. He didn't get any answers from the wind or the bare trees or the granite headstone, but somehow just saying it all out loud helped. Linda wasn't here to tell him what to do, but he knew her well enough to know what she'd say. Stop drowning in your own pride and accept help when it's offered. Rick stayed at the cemetery until his feet went numb, then drove home. Monday morning, he opened the garage as usual. The Subaru was still on the lift, waiting for the catalytic converter he'd ordered 2 weeks ago. The vintage motorcycle sat in the corner, a restoration project that had become a symbol of all the things Rick kept putting off. At 10 o'clock, Rick made a decision. He pulled out his phone and called Katie Carson. "Mr. Donovan, I was hoping I'd hear from you. Call me Rick, and I want to take you up on your offer about working together." "Really? That's great. When do you want to meet and discuss details?" "How about now? Can you take a break?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Katie showed up in a clean but older Ford Ranger, proving she wasn't above driving a truck with some miles on it. She came into the garage and looked around with genuine interest, not the patronizing assessment Rick had been afraid of. "This is a great space," she said. "Good bones. Your father built it? Bought the building in '62, opened the shop in '63. I've been here my whole life, basically." They walked to the office. Rick had made coffee, the strong kind he'd been drinking for 40 years. Katie accepted a cup and sat in the client chair across from his desk. She pulled out a notebook, an actual paper notebook, not a tablet or phone, and clicked her pen. "So," she said, "let's talk about what collaboration could look like." They spent 2 hours working through the details. Katie proposed a referral system where each shop would recommend the other for specific types of work. She'd send vintage vehicles, custom builds, and anything requiring old-school mechanical expertise to Rick. He'd send newer vehicles, anything needing advanced diagnostics, and warranty work to her. Rick found himself impressed by how thoroughly she'd thought this through. She had spreadsheets showing potential revenue splits, examples of referral agreements from other industries, even mock-ups of how they could cross-promote on social media. "You've been planning this for a while," Rick observed, "since about 2 days after Tom Henderson brought his truck to me." And Katie admitted, "I could see the writing on the wall. This town isn't big enough for 2 full-service shops competing head-to-head. But it might be big enough for 2 shops that complement each other." "What about pricing?" Rick asked. "You're cheaper than me on most jobs, because I have economies of scale with parts suppliers and lower overhead on some things. But you have expertise that saves time on complex mechanical issues. Different pricing models for different services. You charge what you need to charge for vintage work. I charge what I need to charge for modern diagnostics. Customers choose based on the value they're getting, not just the bottom line." "You're not worried I'll undercut you once I have the customers?" Katie smiled. "Are you planning to?" "No." "Then I'm not worried. Look, Rick, I'm not trying to put you out of business. I want both our shops to thrive. This town is big enough for that if we're smart about it." They shook hands on the agreement. Katie would send over a simple referral contract for them both to sign. Nothing complicated or binding, just a framework for how they'd work together. After she left, Rick sat at his desk feeling strange. Lighter, maybe, or just different. He'd spent 42 years being the sole proprietor, the independent operator, the guy who did things his way. Now he had a partner, sort of. A much younger partner who'd just proven herself better at modern diagnostics than him. It was humbling, but it was also liberating. Rick pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making notes. If this partnership was going to work, he needed to be intentional about it. He wrote down his strengths: vintage vehicle expertise, mechanical intuition, customer relationships built over decades, knowledge of local suppliers and resources. Then he wrote down his weaknesses: outdated diagnostic equipment, limited understanding of modern computer systems, difficulty marketing to younger customers, resistance to change. Seeing it written out made it clear that Katie's proposal wasn't charity. She genuinely needed what he brought to the table, just as he needed what she offered. It was a real partnership built on complementary strengths rather than pity or obligation. His phone rang. It was a customer he hadn't heard from in months, calling about a 1978 Corvette that needed engine work. "I heard you're the guy for vintage Chevy engines," the customer said. "Got a recommendation from Katie over at Carson's shop." Rick scheduled the appointment, hung up and laughed quietly to himself. The referrals were already starting. Over the next 3 weeks, Rick's garage saw a subtle shift. Katie sent him 2 more vintage restoration projects and a customer with a classic BMW that needed carburetor work. In return, Rick referred a customer with a 2022 Toyota that needed transmission diagnostics and another with a Nissan that kept throwing computer codes he couldn't read with his older equipment. The financial arrangement worked smoothly. Rick charged what he needed to charge. Katie charged what she needed to charge, and customers got directed to whoever could best serve them. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but Rick's appointment book started filling up again with the kind of work he actually enjoyed doing. More importantly, the quality of his work improved. Without the pressure to handle everything himself, Rick could focus on what he did best. He wasn't rushing through brake jobs to get to the next customer. He was taking his time with complex mechanical restorations, doing the meticulous work that had made his reputation in the first place. One afternoon, he was adjusting valves on a vintage Harley-Davidson when he realized he was whistling. He couldn't remember the last time he'd whistled while working. The joy had come back, the satisfaction of solving mechanical puzzles and bringing old machines back to life. On a Wednesday in mid-December, Katie called him about a peculiar problem. She had a customer with a 1965 Mustang Fastback that had been sitting in a barn for 20 years. The owner wanted it restored to running condition, and Katie's crew had modern vehicle expertise but limited experience with vintage carburetors and distributor systems. "Want to collaborate on it?" she asked. "We'll do the bodywork and modern safety upgrades. You handle the engine and mechanical restoration." "That's a big project. Could take months." "I know, but we could do something really special with it. Split the work, split the profit." "What do you say?" Rick walked over to the photograph of his father on the wall. This was exactly the kind of project his dad had loved. Bringing a classic back to life, seeing potential where others saw a rusting hulk. "Yeah," Rick said, "let's do it." The Mustang arrived on a flatbed truck 2 days later. It was rough, with surface rust, flat tires, and an engine that hadn't turned over in 2 decades. But underneath the neglect, Rick could see the bones of something beautiful. Katie came over that afternoon to assess the project. They stood side by side, looking at the car, making notes about what needed to be done. "This is going to be fun," Katie said. "It's going to be a lot of work," Rick countered. "Same thing." Rick ran his hand along the Mustang's fender, feeling the curves beneath the rust. "My father and I restored one of these back in 1984. Customer's car, not ours. Guy had inherited it from his uncle, wanted it brought back to life. Took us 6 months. I was 24 years old, thought I knew everything. Dad let me take the lead, just supervised and gave advice when I asked for it." "Did you ask for it often?" Rick smiled. "Almost never. I was too stubborn. Made mistakes I could have avoided if I'd just listened to him. But he never said, 'I told you so.' Just helped me fix what I'd messed up and trusted me to learn from it." "Sounds like a good teacher." "He was. I didn't appreciate it enough at the time." Rick paused. "That's what you've been doing with me, isn't it?" letting me figure things out, offering help without making me feel like an idiot. Katie shrugged. We all need teachers, Rick, and we all need to be willing to be students, no matter how old we get. Over the following weeks, they developed a rhythm. Katie's shop would do the bodywork, stripping rust, repairing panels, preparing for paint. Rick would rebuild the engine, overhaul the transmission, restore the suspension and brake systems. They'd consult on decisions, share expertise, and learn from each other. Rick found himself looking forward to Katie's visits. She'd stop by with questions about how certain vintage systems worked, and Rick would explain the mechanical logic that modern engineers had long since computerized. In return, Katie showed him how to use diagnostic software he'd been intimidated by, demonstrating that the technology wasn't as complicated as he'd feared. "You've got the hardest part already," she told him during one of these sessions. "You understand how the systems work. The computer just helps you see what's happening faster." The work was slow but satisfying. Rick would spend hours on small details, ensuring every bolt was properly torqued, every gasket seated perfectly, every adjustment precise. Katie's team matched his thoroughness with their own, taking the time to get the bodywork exactly right, refusing to rush just to finish faster. One afternoon in late January, Rick was working on the Mustang's carburetor when he heard footsteps in the garage. He looked up to find Tom Henderson standing there, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. "Tom, didn't expect to see you. I wanted to come by, talk to you in person." Rick set down his tools and wiped his hands. "I owe you an apology. Should have given it to you weeks ago. I was wrong about your truck's engine. And I nearly cost you thousands of dollars because I was too proud to run proper diagnostics. I'm sorry." Tom nodded slowly. "Katie told me you came by her shop, looked at the engine yourself." "I did. She was right, I was wrong. Simple as that." "Nothing simple about admitting you made a mistake," Tom said, "especially for someone with your reputation. That took guts, Rick." "Or desperation." Tom walked over to look at the Mustang. "What's this?" "Restoration project. Working on it with Katie. Customer wants it done by spring." "You're working together now?" "Trying to, seeing if it makes sense." Rick paused. "Tom, I understand if you don't want to bring your vehicles here anymore. I wouldn't blame you. Actually, that's why I came by. I've got my old Ford Explorer, the '98. Need some work on the four-wheel drive system. Katie said it's old enough that you'd be the better person to look at it. Said you've got more experience with the older transfer case designs, so I figured I'd bring it to you if you're interested." Rick felt something tight in his chest loosen. Yeah, I'm interested. Bring it by any time." After Tom left, Rick stood in the garage feeling lighter than he had in months. One customer didn't fix everything, didn't erase his mistake or guarantee the garage's future. But it was something. A vote of confidence, a second chance. One evening in early January, Rick was working late on the Mustang's engine when Sarah called. "Dad, I wanted to check in. How are you doing?" "Good, actually. Really good." "Yeah? You sound different. What's going on?" Rick told her about the partnership with Katie, about the Mustang project, about how his appointment book was fuller than it had been in 2 years. He told her about Tom coming back, about the way other customers were starting to return, about how he'd enrolled in an online course Katie had recommended about modern fuel systems. "That's wonderful. Dad, I'm proud of you." "For what?" "For being willing to change, for not being too stubborn to accept help. Mom would be proud too." After they hung up, Rick went back to work on the engine. The Mustang's engine block was on his workbench, cleaned and inspected, waiting for reassembly. It was sound, solid, just needed proper attention to run again. Not unlike Rick himself. By late February, the Mustang was nearly complete. Katie's team had done beautiful bodywork, and the car wore a fresh coat of Wimbledon white paint. Rick had rebuilt the 289 V8 engine to factory specifications, overhauled the 4-speed manual transmission, and restored the suspension to better than original condition. The transformation had taken 3 months of meticulous work. Rick had spent countless hours on the engine alone, balancing each component, ensuring every tolerance was within factory specs. He'd discovered that working with Katie's team had taught him patience he didn't know he'd lost somewhere along the way. When one of her younger mechanics, a kid named Marcus, who couldn't have been more than 25, suggested a better way to route the new wiring harness, Rick had actually listened, and Marcus had been right. "You know what I appreciate about you, Rick," Marcus had said while they worked together on the electrical system. "You don't talk down to us. My dad was a mechanic, old school like you. He treated every young guy like an idiot, but you actually explain why things work the way they do." Rick had thought about that conversation for days afterward. Maybe teaching was part of the legacy too, not just keeping his father's garage alive, but passing knowledge forward to people who'd carry it into the future. The day they fired up the engine for the first time, both shops' employees gathered around. Rick turned the key, the starter engaged, and the V8 roared to life with a sound that hadn't existed in 20 years. Everyone cheered. Katie stood next to Rick, both of them grinning like idiots. "We did good work," she said. "We did great work," Rick corrected. The customer picked up the Mustang a week later and cried when he saw it. The car that had been his father's, that he'd inherited and let deteriorate, was now pristine and running perfectly. He paid them their fee without question, took dozens of photos and promised to bring it back for an annual tune-up. "You brought my dad back to life," the customer said, his voice breaking. "Every time I drive this, I'll think of him." After he left, Katie and Rick split the profit and sat in Rick's office drinking coffee. The satisfaction of that moment, knowing they'd restored not just a car, but a connection between father and son, felt more valuable than any paycheck. "I've been thinking," Katie said. "This partnership has worked out well. What if we made it more official?" "How do you mean?" "I'm not talking about a merger or anything like that, but maybe we formalize the arrangement. Create a combined brand for certain projects. Share some resources, maybe some employees eventually. Keep our individual shops but work more closely together." Rick considered it. 6 months ago, the suggestion would have felt like a threat. Now it felt like an opportunity. "Let me think about it," he said, "but I'm not opposed." Rick reflects on how his once struggling family garage has become stable and meaningful again through partnership and growth. At 63, he realizes that true expertise comes from humility, collaboration, and knowing one's limits. His partner, Katie, reveals an offer to sell her shop to a large dealership chain, but instead proposes merging their businesses, combining Rick's legacy and craftsmanship with her modern systems and resources. After thoughtful consideration, Rick agrees, setting boundaries that honor his father's name, his personal life, and the garage's values. Their partnership flourishes, symbolized by a flawless Mustang restoration that brings pride and renewed hope. Rick finds purpose not only in his work, but in passing his knowledge to the next generation, especially his granddaughter, Emma. Through family, collaboration, and adaptation, Rick learns that legacy is not about preserving the past unchanged, but about carrying forward its values while allowing growth. By the end, he feels peace, renewed purpose, and optimism for the future, realizing that, like a repairable engine, he too was never beyond saving.